Welcome back. This is Coketown, and it's time for another look at the current state of the player base for War of Rights. Now, just as a reminder, this is not an analysis of the health of the game or how it's doing as a business model. I don't have access to metrics to begin to judge something like that. Rather, this is merely tracing the trends in the overall player base based on the average players on a monthly basis using the data provided by Steam Charts. Not to bury the lead, but War of Rights hit some massive highs in the past 6 months, indicating a lot of growth potential and continued interest based primarily on these special events. Unfortunately, that success did not translate into sustained interest in the game, as we saw not only substantial plummets, but the levels below the averages from the past several years as well. As I've said in previous videos covering this topic, I use the average player base instead of a maximum, as that tends to only measure the peak periods for the game, namely at NA times, and it fails to take into account the Oceania and EU side of the community. So I think it's a little bit even better metric using that one. Now, just to reiterate again, this is not a reflection on the economics of the game or how well Campfire Games is doing as a company or as a developer. I'm only looking at one aspect, which is the player base, as the only revenue generated for the game occurs at the point of purchase or when it's sold. It is reasonable that sales is a more important metric for the development team. However, I still think that the average player base can serve as a good indicator, if indirect, on the current health of the game, at least related to its community and the player base. So with that out of the way, let's get into the numbers. So starting where I left off last time, with July we had the 1776 event, which coincided with the July 4th holiday in the United States. This was a widely successful event and produced what was at the time the highest average player count for the game at 367. This number even managed to outstrip the highs from July of 2020, the previous high, which had the benefit of the artillery update coming out, the early onset of COVID increasing gaming hours, and the game being featured on the Steam homepage. Now, this high shows that there's still a huge appetite both within the existing community as well as a wider audience for this particular event. It's a shame that the next month of August saw a collapse in the numbers, even sharper than the drop in 2020 after the artillery came out, falling to 249. Now, this is the same level as it was in 2024. Now, this likely indicates, at least to me, a lack of sufficient retention for the new and returning audience that came in for the special event with the 1776. However, the fact that it is nearly at the same level of 2024 is troubling, as it shows that the overall health of the player base may be stagnant and only masked by rises associated with the special events. September represented an even worse decline, as numbers dropped all the way down to 205, below the 2024 number, an overall 40% drop from the high the game saw in July. Now, September tends to see a decline, as indicated from previous years, perhaps related to work school schedules starting up. However, the concern that I have is that it is dropping below the previous year's numbers, despite the high that was reached in July. This seems like a pretty big problem to me. Now, good news certainly came with the zombie event for October, which saw expanded maps and game modes, along with a new and longer period in which the event took place. The success of this particular seasonal event cannot be understated, as War of Rights shattered its previous record just set in July and reached an average player count of 402. The model of seasonal events does seem to really pay off well, and has certainly proven its viability to not only energize the existing player base, but to expand its reach to new players and or tempt back old players to the game. Unfortunately, we see the same pattern that happened with 1776 this time in November, with numbers collapsing even further down to 206 for that month. Now, this month is a bit harder to judge against previous iterations, as the past 2 years had the zombie event during the full part of this period. Now, regardless, though, it did drop down to levels below not only the 2024 and 2023 numbers, but were essentially the same level as 2020. But again, this is much harder to judge because of the way the event took place in the previous years to this year. What does seem apparent, though, is the same problem of retention is still an issue, although likely exacerbated with the timing both for the event and the holiday season, and possibly other things like end of term for school and things like that. So I'm writing this particular piece on the 28th of December, so I'm missing the last few days for that month, but I don't expect any significant shift. As per usual, the December month also had the winter event associated with it, but unlike last year, did not have a major update. Last year, for example, we had the drill camp skirmish maps dropped along with the winter event. Now, fortunately, that wasn't a significant decline, with the numbers staying steady at 202, but this does represent a lower level in both 2024 and 2023 to end the year on, if not a low note, then a steady note. So what's the takeaway from all this? Well, for my book, to start with the game, it is certainly not dying, it's not on its way out, and in fact, I wouldn't even say it's stagnant. The huge success, and I can't stress this enough, for both the 1776 event and the zombie event, shows that there is still a ton of room for growth for the player base for this particular game. Furthermore, I am hopeful that with the new sales associated with the special events, this will help drive development for the game in a way that would not have been possible without them. As I said at the end of last year, I think that devs should continue to deliver enjoyable seasonal events and possibly expand them further, if feasible. On the other hand, the drop in numbers to levels below previous years is worrying to me. The numbers appear stable, but interest in the current game also appears limited and may continue to attrit further if additional content is not released. The spikes from the seasonal events may drive sales, but it's clear to me that they do not enable retention of a player base for the game in its normal state. At the end of the day, the base game will likely still need additional content, which the devs have indicated they are working towards to sustain its current player base, let alone actually grow it. These events won't do it. So, that wraps it up for the second half of 2025. Just to summarize, War of Rights has had massive new highs with these seasonal events, but there exists some potential problems with retention for the base game. We'll see what's in store for 2026. I hope you enjoyed this quick video going over the current state for the War of Rights player base. Have a happy new year, and see you in 2026.